Hi everybody, welcome to Skillsoft Off the Shelf. I'm Tara O'Sullivan for Skillsoft, and today I'm delighted to welcome Michael Rena, whose book Adaptive Space we're going to be talking about today. Michael, thank you so much for being here today. Tell me, why did you write Adaptive Space and who really is the audience for the book?
We live in really interesting times, and if you think about it, just read the newspapers on a day-to-day basis, and you can hardly get past the front page before you hear about an organization that's going bankrupt, an organization that is merging with another organization, or at least one that is poised for disruption. So, I wrote Adaptive Space really to respond to that dilemma, to respond to this dilemma of, we live in the era of disruption. John Chambers says it best, in a little quote where and quite starkly, where he basically says that, organizations today must transform, they must reinvent themselves, or they will be disrupted. And he goes on to say it will be a brutal disruption to the point where organizations won't exist in the next 10 to 15 years as they do today. And I just don't think that we have responded as organizational scientists to come up with the solution for that. So Adaptive Space is really to shift that narrative. Adaptive Space is really to help organizations transform because they're mostly not capable of doing that, at least in today's modern era of disruption. So the book is really intended first for leaders to shift that narrative, to challenge leaders to think beyond the one-size-fits-all approach and to think about multitude of sort of social connections and arrangements, and also for individuals within organizations to help them really think about their ideas and think about how they can get their ideas, first of all, enacted inside of an organization, shifted, and then ultimately adopted inside of an organization through a few sets of principles.
You talk a lot in the book about how companies are being disrupted and they're not actually doing anything different about it. They're allowing it to happen, they're ignoring it, they're maybe making one or two tweaks, but they're not really changing how they do things. How can Adaptive Space help companies who are being disrupted?
We shouldn't be surprised by that notion. Organizations have grown up, they're successful because they are where they are, and whenever change hits them, they try to double down on what I called ordered response solutions, which is, let's put in more control and command. Let's put in more, sort of process and standardization, when in reality, what they need is what we call an adaptive response. So Adaptive Space is really predicated on this simple fact, and we discovered this through a decade worth of research. Organizations must have operational systems. That's how they pay the bills. But many organizations also, all organizations that we looked at also had entrepreneurial pockets of activity. The challenge was getting those new ideas deep inside these pockets inside of an organization, really sort of seeded into the operational system, if you will, so that they can scale them and produce greater results for sort of future growth. And that's the concept of Adaptive Space. I describe it as a social bridge, between these entrepreneurial pockets and the operational system, so that organizations can be fast and nimble by creating new ideas inside these pockets, but can also be stable enough to produce results. And both are incredibly necessary. And unfortunately, it's very rare. There was a McKinsey study done not long ago that suggests that less than 12% of companies are able to do those two things combined.
Are there different people, as in talent, that you need in the keeping all the lights on and keeping everything normal versus in the entrepreneurial pockets? So do you target people, do you invite people, or do you allow people to put their hands up? How do you change the talent?
Sort of the core of Adaptive Space. First of all, I spent almost my entire career in the talent space. So I've been looking at skills and experiences and human capital, for most of my career. And I think the real sort of central component to Adaptive Space is we're shifting from a world of human capital into sort of a new era of social capital. So the short answer is yes, there are different people, but far more importantly than that is the way you arrange those people is far more critical. So think about it this way. Human capital is what you know and what experiences you have, based on previous, encounters that you've had. Social capital is about how well you're positioned to leverage what you know. So, Adaptive Space in short is really how do you position people in different social configurations so that they can be adaptive and responsive. And that requires a multitude of different types of people, but just as importantly, a multitude of different social arrangements.
Can you share the concept of 4D connections in your concept of adaptive space?
Organizations can no longer rely on these one-size-fits-all, sort of mindsets of this is what we do to produce results. So they've got to constantly be fluxing and shifting and responding to what's happening in the outside world. So the very first thing they need to do is they need to be discovering. They need to constantly have outside people outside the organization so that they don't become insular and they're paying attention to the speed of the world around them so that they can respond and enact new solutions and future growth possibilities. But that's not enough. Ideas are cheap, and organizations can generate all kinds of ideas through discovery connections, but they've got to bring them into the world. And to do that, it's like a whole different set of configurations. Amazon describes them as 2 pizza teams, small, cohesive teams that are very deeply trusting of one another with redundant connections, and they're wonderful at bringing ideas into the world. They get ideas from conception into reality, and they build minimum viable products. But that's not enough. Oftentimes what happens is you generate a new idea inside of one of these pockets, and then the antibodies kick in. The rest of the organization rejects it, and what we know is 43% of the time something designed in one of these entrepreneurial pockets will be stifled out by the broader organization. So then you need to shift to what I call diffusion connections, which is thinking about how do I get the organization buzzed up? How do I seed the organizational network in order to get other people encouraged about this idea? And how do I go find energizers that will really help to advocate for this idea? And then ultimately, those 3 sets of connections lead to the 4th one, which is a set of disruption connections, which really help to usher in the new normal. It disrupts the status quo, ushers in this new idea, and then sort of jumps to the next set of possibilities.
We're talking about this in theory, Michael. Can you give me an example of this in practice in the real world?
One that we would all know, and I think resonates with people quite a bit, is the contrasting story between Blockbuster and Netflix. Now, certainly it's been told a lot, but really the part of the story that hasn't been told a lot is not just that Netflix disrupted Blockbuster, which is the obvious part of the story, and Blockbuster doubled down on the one-size-fits-all approach, where Netflix came out with a new sort of emergent idea. But Netflix since then has continued to iterate and agilely shift to the next thing. So Netflix is the perfect illustration of a company that has been creating adaptive responses on an ongoing basis to the outside market. First with direct mail DVDs. Second with downloadable content, real-time streamed content. And then most recently with their own productions. And basically now they're a content creator, and they've leveraged and built this channel to really be able to push content through. And each time they made those moves, it was in response to what the market was telling them they should do. Rather than doubling down on direct DVDs by mail, which would have put them out of business by now, they continued to shift, and they continued to pay attention to the outside market on an ongoing basis.
What I found really interesting about that story was that Blockbuster, what was determined is that Blockbuster needed those late fees. That's how they were making the money. But what I also thought was really interesting is that even though Netflix, when they began the content creation, they got a negative feedback from the customers, they kept doing it, but in a smaller way, to make sure that was seen as a kind of a backup for when the direct-to-DVD market started to wane.
Yeah, I remember exactly when that happened because it was a bold move. I remember the day that they decided they were going to split the organization in 2, and I thought to myself, wow, this is a company that gets it, even in the moment. And then the consumer, there was this whole backlash from the consumer in the moment. And what they did was they responded appropriately to what the consumer wanted in the moment, but they continued to press forward, in much more of a, I would say, covert manner, on what their core strategy was. And you can see where Netflix is today in response to that. And Reed Hastings is, he's been known for saying organizations rarely move too fast. And I think that may have been a case where they moved too fast, but they were able to pivot and shift, which again, I think is the real real sort of indication of adaptive responses and catch up with what they needed to do and then give their customers what they needed.
And do you think the kind of adaptive space concept needs a leader at the top of the organization or the top of the group to make sure it happens, or can it, so obviously with Netflix there is a really obvious leader, or can it be developed internally by people?
This is the beauty of adaptive space, is both are necessary and you can start in either place. So if you've got a top-down strategy and you've got a leader that can really enact this, okay, so that's certainly helpful and ultimately necessary. But you can also do it in an emergent manner. I think of W.L. Gore and Associates, and they've been an adaptive responsive company since its inception, and they continue to respond and think about the market shifts and adapt around what those market shifts are, and that it's done in much more of an emergent manner. And there are other stories throughout the book, like Nucor and other organizations. We certainly have done this at General Motors with something called GM 2020. So you can start in either direction. You need some leadership support to get started, but it's not the type of leadership support that we have thought about traditionally. What you really need is some degree of freedom to be able to exchange ideas in a much more open manner. What you don't need is outright sponsorship and somebody to fully endorse and invest in the next billion-dollar business when no one really has a clue if this thing's going to work or not.
You talk in the book about connectors. I really loved this chapter. And we all know we can identify people who are leaders, who are really good connectors, but you go a little bit further in how important they are in leading adaptive change. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so connectors get stuff done. Again, ideas are cheap. You must have them, right? If you don't have new ideas, you can't continue to refresh your organization. But oftentimes that's where organizations falter. They don't bring those ideas into the world. Connectors are oftentimes deep domain experts with great credibility. So a central connector by definition is someone who sits in the center of a team, is trusted and respected. People around them know what they know, and they're able to bring things into the world. So one of my favorite stories in the book is recasting our view of Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison is known in the world as a great inventor, and we think of inventors as being incredibly creative people. And Thomas Edison, I think rightfully defines himself as a sponge. And what he was really doing was soaking up what everybody else knew and then enabling his team. And I think the part of the story that's rarely told is the band of people that surrounded Thomas Edison, which he called his muckers. And his muckers were the people, small two-pizza teams, maybe 8 people at a time, that were constantly testing and iterating new ideas and trying to figure out which one worked in practice so that they could get that product scaled and commercialized in a way that, and we don't tell that part of the Thomas Edison story. We don't talk about the band of muckers behind the scenes. And every organization needs to have a band of muckers that are thinking about how do we take these ideas and bring them into the world in a very fast way. And it's really important to say this last piece. Those small cohesive teams can operate much faster than the rest of the organization, up to 20 times faster, based on the social, sort of accord that they have already within that group. And that's exactly what the muckers did in Thomas Edison's invention factory.
You have some great ways for organizations and leaders to open up adaptive space. You talk about engaging the edges, finding a friend, follow the energy, and embrace the conflict. Just starting with engaging the edges, talk to me about that as the first kind of process.
Yeah, so again, I wanted this to be grounded in science, but theory is cheap. And what we really wanted to do is enact a set of principles where any individual inside of an organization could sort of chart their own course. So, engaging the edges is really all about discovery. How do you get outside of your day-to-day bubble, and how do you actually get out and discover something new? And I'll give you a real example to sort of illustrate this. So, at General Motors, we make a lot of trucks, and we sell a lot of trucks in the center of the United States. And the world is navigating, or migrating, I should say, to urban centers. So if you want to understand the different customer group, you've got to go to the edge of where your current business is and try to discover something new. So one of the things we did was we were interested in luxury transportation inside of urban environments. So we picked a small team of people, sent them out into metropolitan cities, Manhattan. They actually went to San Francisco. They spent some time in Austin and studied luxury as it related to what the customer demands are today. And what they discovered was a really simple, this will sound so nuanced, but what they discovered was something really simple, and that is that the emerging generation today wants access to luxury without ownership of it. So in other words, they don't want to sink $80,000 into a vehicle, but they want to have that experience from time to time. So this team that went to the edges first to discover this fairly novel insight designed an entire new product called Booked by Cadillac, which basically is a subscription service to a luxury vehicle brand that you can buy into on a month-to-month basis and therefore have access over ownership of luxury.
The next piece is called Find a Friend. And talk to me about why innovators need to find somebody in the organization who is going to friend that idea.
Well, this is one of my favorite principles, and mostly because we have been conditioned to think, I've got a great idea, I need to go find a leader that's going to endorse it. Frankly, that may be the worst thing you could do. Leaders are presented with new ideas every single day, and by their very definition of a leader, they're optimizing resources, so your idea is a burden to them. It's at least noise, and it's easy for them to dismiss it. Even if they accept it, as soon as times get tough, they could easily turn tables and go pick the next best idea. A far better strategy is to go find a friend. And I don't know about you, Tara, but I have 10 new ideas a day. And at the end of the day, one of them might be good even to me. So if I go find a friend and I socialize that idea with them, it does a couple things. It gives me an initial gut check on, is this idea really good? And then secondly, if it is in fact good, it builds confidence. And that friend helps to embolden me. And there's lots of social research to illustrate this. Solomon Asch, way back in the 1950s, said, you need to go find one single ally, and it will embolden you to actually, step into the conflict and ongoing sort of, disruption that you're about ready to create. And that all starts with go find a friend. And once you find one friend and you've, tested that idea with them, go find a couple more. And it's much more of a groundswell approach to creating a bold new idea than the more traditional approach of I'm going to go take my idea and I'm going to go share it with a leader.
In the book, you talked about Slack, I think, and Facebook, and how they really worked on that idea of going to find a friend and going and it became almost a movement.
So Slack is a perfect illustration of this, right? Slack, sort of came out of nowhere, and they really enacted a few of these principles. First thing they did was, they found the white space. They went to the edge. They found the white space, an opportunity. They sold it then at the individual level as opposed to at the corporate level. They sold their initial solution at the individual level, and they basically were seeding their network by getting people, friends, buzzed up about it and creating sort of this grassroots movement around the product that ultimately, energized, and diffused across the broader organization to where corporations are now adopting it as their corporate solution for collaboration inside of large, complex organizations.
And with no marketing, all the buzz was created by the users.
Yeah, completely. And if you can seed your network first with a handful of friends, and you can get them to talk about your idea, and more importantly, it becomes partly their idea as well. What ends up happening is you drive radical diffusion both inside and outside of an organization. And again, I think Slack did that. There are a multitude of other companies that really tap into this whole concept of energy.
And that's the next feature, is around follow the energy. And it's about finding the right people to really bring energy to your idea and to making sure that idea happens. Tell me a little bit about that.
One of the things I oftentimes say to people when I'm coaching them is, be careful of the company you keep. If you're hanging out with people that are, whining and crying about somebody who's not in the circle right now, chances are they're a de-energizer. And chances are when you're not there, they're doing the same thing about you. But if you find those positive energizers and you really tap into the power of positive energy, it could create an an incredible tipping point inside of an organization. And I can think of a couple different illustrations of that. One of my favorite stories in the book is about an MBA study. And, it was a simulation, just a simple classroom simulation where groups were, responsible for basically negotiating compensation packages for given employees. But what they didn't know is different groups were seated with different types of behaviors. They had an actor, amongst them that no one knew about in the group. Those groups that had a negative actor that was really, sort of the naysayer, if you will, actually underperformed. Those groups that had positive actors, that were buzzing up the ideas and yes and in the ideas and challenging people to think about it from a different perspective, way outperformed the other groups. And most of the people inside the groups in the after action review had no clue. They were chalking it up to great negotiation strategies. In reality, on an ongoing basis, it had as much to do with the social climate and what was happening inside, that buzzed network than anything else. And I guess one other study real quickly, we've studied, what it looks like to put somebody into a toxic team. And if you drop somebody, even a high energy person, into a toxic team, their energy drops threefold almost immediately. But if you put them into a positive team, the opposite happens. They get lifted up and in fact, they feel like they can be their better self inside of the organization.
When we think about GM, we don't exactly think about GM as a global powerhouse of, adaptive space and innovation. But it's very clear that that's one of the things that you're doing in the organization. Tell us about that.
This whole concept of bringing adaptive space to General Motors and trying to enact it inside of a fairly large, traditionally bureaucratic organization has just been a blast for me. And the reality is, the organization first had to become less insular, had to start thinking about, the future mobility in a much more radical way, had to start doing more discovery, like the book by Cadillac story I shared a few moments ago, but then had to create the adaptive space or the freedom within the organization for these social interactions to occur. So, I could tell all kinds of stories about how that happened. My two favorite are, GM 2020, and then also what we're doing with, self-driving, sort of the future mobility and self-driving vehicles. GM 2020 was completely organic. It was a grassroots initiative, where a group of people got together in 2014, small group of people got together in 2014 and asked a simple question. What would it look like if we positively disrupted the way we work? And they picked the year 2020 as sort of their milestone. And rather than, commissioning, a bold new strategy, they decided to act their way there. And through a series of small little actions, person by person, all local, almost all frontline, they were able to radically shift the way the organization thought about certain things to the point where I think that first group gathered and there were about 50 people in the room. We just did an event, just a few weeks ago, and by volunteers only, over 1,000 people showed up and it was sold out. Many other people would have liked to have been there, but the venue simply wouldn't hold that many people. So people get fired up and excited about new possibilities, and it can happen again in an organic way, much like that, or it can be in a much more structured way, like what we're doing with cruise automation, which is our future bet on self-driving vehicles. And that was an acquisition, first off, a small group of people out in Silicon Valley who, had some algorithms and knowledge about, what it looks like to build sensors for self-driving vehicles. But then we put them into a bunch of development teams, a series of small two-pizza teams. And in about 18 months, through a series of iterations, these small little teams were able to actually create 4 generations of self-driving technology to the extent that, in a very short time frame, you're going to see, commercial product out on the streets. The product's already there today, and it's collecting data on a day-to-day basis. But, in a very short time frame, you're going to see self-driving vehicles out on the streets, and that all happened through thinking about social configurations, thinking about bridging mechanisms, and how can you protect those entities until, they stand up, because they're very fragile early days. And the mothership will strangle them out if you're not thoughtful. So keeping them slightly partitioned off, but not so partitioned off that they can't be pulled in and become the new core. in some future move.
So Steve Jobs talked about new ideas are very fragile and need to be protected, right? And you have mentioned before that an awful lot of new ideas fail. So how do you make sure that those new ideas get brought into the organization in a way that you make them as successful as they possibly can be?
This is one of the core concepts in the book. I think one of the things that we just simply haven't done inside of corporations is really protecting our bets. So think about it this way. There are lots of accelerators, there are lots of incubators, and most of them aren't that successful. It has nothing to do with the idea. They have great quality ideas, and you can point across the world where given incubators tested an idea for a company and it's out in the market, but somebody else brought it to market. It's this whole concept of how do you build bridges into the organization. And that's really, you have to think about that before you ever get started. You have to think about what's the small bet I want to place on the edge? How do I protect it? And the best way to do that is not picking up these most entrepreneurial thinking people in the world. Those are the people that will bring things into the world, but you got to think about who's the socially most credible person in the center of the organization and how you place them out on the edge of the organization to protect that bet. So they're bridges. In the early days, they're protecting that bet. They're helping it to come to life. They're pulling in some resources when needed from the broader corporation. In the later days, when that idea has sort of reached minimum viable product, they're pulling it in and they're trying to get it scaled. So they're helping to construct more and more bridges around things like, how does marketing help this? Or, how do we actually brand this product? Or how do we get this product, to operations at speed? And that's what that bridge person does. If you don't have those bridge people in the early days, you're doomed for failure. And I think it's maybe the most critical move of everything, because we're pretty good at some of these other things already. We just haven't thought enough about the bridge people and the brokers and how do we proactively position them to drive future success.
How do you make sure we hire and train people who make sure they can deal with conflict, that they can deal with this concept of adaptation? That, how do we get the right people in the organization or train them given with the skills shortage?
It's been my experience that we already have these people, and they're dying to unleash their own potential. And if you actually just create space, open up some space inside of the organization for these things to happen, you'll be stunned by the way people sort of rally around the cause. So it's been my experience that if you open up space, give them freedom, give them the chance to go do discovery, give them the chance to interact with friends locally to bring something into the world, that that capacity is already there. It's a latent potential that I believe exists inside most organizations. So the real question is, how do I create these different social configurations? And I think that's where you practice different things. You could use something like design thinking. Design thinking is a perfect illustration of a tool that sends you out to go do empathy or discovery in the world. Then it forces you to do prototyping, which is development, and bringing something into the world. Then it challenges you to think about how do you go test that prototype, which is both conflict and finding energy and following the energy. So I think we have these methodologies. We certainly have the people. We just haven't been able to really create sort of the social architectures or arrangements to enact it.
And for everybody who's watching today, if there was one thing that you would advise them to do to get started, what would that be?
So for me, it's, go get started. Go get started. Shift your narrative. Shift your narrative away from, I need a leader to come support me, and shift your narrative to, what do I know today? What am I excited about? What am I passionate about? Who are the handful of friends that exist today? Go start a brush fire wherever you exist, and then feed that flame. Feed that flame by following the energy and, respond to the organization whenever there's conflict so that you can grow it and you can get liftoff sooner.
Lastly, you talk about embracing conflict, and an awful lot of people, when they write about leadership books or digital transformation books, they talk about avoiding conflict, right? So tell me about how embracing conflict helps.
So I get more questions on this chapter than any other in the book. And, it's this whole concept of, if there isn't conflict, you ought to be worried as a creator, as an inventor. I take conflict as a compliment, because what I know now is I've got something that has the possibility of being a breakthrough. And if you think about it this way, if there's nothing to break through, you can't have a breakthrough. So conflict is an early indicator that you might have something bold enough to actually be disrupted. The problem is you've got to move past that conflict. And my best illustration of that is what Walt Disney did. And I mean, this going way back in time, but as I was researching the book and dug deep into sort of the archives of Disney, I saw what Walt Disney did with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Think about it. This is 1937 when that movie was released. It was actually labeled Disney's Folly. And just about everybody in the world, including, Walt Disney's own brother, were betting against it. And they thought that it was going to be his doom and that he was going to go bankrupt by this dream that he had, which was a full-length animation movie, which had never been done up to that point in time. So, there was all kinds of conflict. And rather than, sort of shutting it down, he embraced it. And the way he embraced it is he pulled a core group of people together inside the studio, and he challenged them to really charge into the conflict and to think about it as a motivating force so that they could get liftoff sooner. And in essence, the rest of the story. It was a brilliant movie. Some have even said it may have been the best movie ever produced. And the reason for that was because he embraced conflict, his team embraced conflict, and they shifted and sort of adapted and responded to all the different challenges that they had in front of them to create a much bolder outcome than what they would have had otherwise.
Thank you, Michael. And remember, you can find Adaptive Space on your digital transformation channel in Percipio and add it to your reading list today. Thank you.